Aloha, everybody. It is 12 p.m., so we are going to go ahead and get started. So we are hosting today's session from our Botanical Research Center, but we also have panelists joining us today from Florida and Denmark. This is the second of 5 webinars we're hosting this winter and spring season. And our next presentation is going to be on April 13th at 12 p.m. and will feature recent conservation and restoration efforts on Kauai's endangered trees. I'll be dropping the link into the chat shortly if you'd like to register for the next one. And if you're interested in being kept in the know about our future events and aren't already subscribed to our monthly science and conservation newsletter, Go Botanical, you'll be able to sign up on our website, and I'll drop that link into the chat in a moment too. This webinar is being recorded. We'll be sending the recording out to you in a few days. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat box. We definitely encourage that throughout the presentation. And we will be holding a general Q&A at the end. We'll try to get to all of your questions, but if we don't, feel free to follow up with me via email. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Dr. Nina Ronstedt, our Director of Science and Conservation, and she's going to tell you a little bit about today's session.
Good morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are, and thanks for joining us and our webinar today. So this webinar is part of a series of webinars. We want to invite you behind the scenes to meet the people who are leading NTBG science and conservation work. NTBG is dedicated to understand and conserve tropical flora and ecosystems, and Hawaii has about 1360 native plants. And 90% of them are endemic. That means they grow nowhere else on Earth but here in Hawaii. So it's a really unique flora. And in Hawaii, people also have a really close connection with plants, and even dating back to the early Polynesian voyagers who brought along with them a set of useful plants when they first arrived on the islands. You can imagine that you're sailing out in the blue, seeking a new land, and you need to pack everything you might need to live on a new island. What are you going to bring along? They brought a botanical toolkit that included plants for timber, for making clothes, medicinal and ritual plants, and of course essential food plants. And today we'll be focusing on Artocarpus Annulatus, also known as breadfruit or ulu in Hawaii. NTBG has been involved in exploring and understanding and promoting breadfruit for several decades through the Breadfruit Institute that has been led by Dr. Diane Ragoni, who spent many years traveling and learning about breadfruit and its propagation and nutritious values. And today we'll hear from Noel Dickinson, who's the coordinator of the Breadfruit Institute, about NTBG's work and about the regenerative organic breadfruit forest, or ROBA, that we have established here in our gardens. You will also hear about a small study that was conducted by students Emile Berning and Carl Holmquist from Denmark, who worked with NTBG to do their master thesis. And they were trying to understand how the COVID pandemic has impacted breadfruit farmers' perspectives on growing and working with breadfruit. And finally, we'll be hearing from Dr. Elliot Gardner, who's a joint postdoctoral researcher between NTBG and the International Center for Tropical Botany at the Kampong, so in our Florida garden, which is an initiative we are running together with Florida International University. And Elliot has worked on breadfruit genetics and breadfruit relatives for a long time, and will tell us a little bit about what the other plants in this group looks like, and tell us a little bit about some new species he's been involved in discovering as well. So welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Should I start, Nina?
Yes, go for it, Noel.
Okay.
Go ahead and screen share.
Okay, so let me share my screen. My name is Noel Dickinson, and I am coordinator for the Breadfruit Institute. And so let me get this going. And I want to, okay, so like I said, I'm Noel Dickinson, and I'm coordinator for the Breadfruit Institute. I'm also the Agroforestry project manager for the Regenerative Organic Breadfruit Agroforestry demonstration here in McBryde Garden. So the Breadfruit Institute is responsible for the care and management of the world's largest and most comprehensive collection of breadfruit varieties, the majority of which are housed at Kahanu Garden in Hana on the island of Maui. The conservation collection is the result of extensive fieldwork done by Dr. Diane Rigoni, and her colleagues throughout the Pacific. The collection is intended to preserve breadfruit diversity and continues to provide unique opportunities for research to better understand this underutilized and bioculturally significant crop. So some basics about breadfruit. So why is it so important? Breadfruit is one of the only staple starches that grows on a tree or is produced by a tree. Here in Hawaii, as Nina mentioned, it's considered a canoe plant. So useful plants that were brought to Hawaii by indigenous peoples as they settled the Pacific Islands. Breadfruit are long-lived tropical trees which seasonally fruit for an average of up to 50 years. Once mature, breadfruit will produce about 100 fruit equaling 300 pounds per season, more or less. Breadfruit are full of complex carbohydrates and minerals. Oops, I went back. Okay. So breadfruit are, as I was saying, breadfruit are full of complex carbohydrates and minerals and providing B vitamins, niacin, thiamine, and vitamin C. Some of the varieties have high levels of provitamin A carotenoids, which are integral to child development. Okay, so the work that I have been directly involved in for the last 5 years has been the establishment of the Regenerative Organic Breadfruit Agroforestry demonstration at McBryde Garden. And so prior to the Agroforestry demonstrations establishment in 2017, this is kind of a bird's eye view of what the breadfruit research orchard looked like. So it's composed of now 32 trees, Artacarpus trees, roughly half of which are breadfruit, and the remainder are breadnut trees. Okay, so this is a current view of the agroforest, which was established, like I said, in 2017. It combines modern horticultural techniques with traditional growing methods. It's dynamic and diverse and is composed of over 200 plant species, and that's excluding the Artacarpus. So agroforestry plants were selected based on usefulness, either as a crop for human use or to serve some use within the system. One of the reasons breadfruit provides a strong backbone for an agroforest is because it requires less labor and land to produce just as much starch crop, if not more than other staple starch crops. Also, because it's a tree, there's no need to till or replant in order to harvest the crop each year. Growing breadfruit requires little to no ecological disturbance and very little labor compared to modern starch crops. And so several agroforestry metrics are monitored, including weekly yields. By the end of last year, 2021, 3,663 individual breadfruit were harvested, and that was equal to a little more than 4.9 tons of breadfruit. Each breadfruit tree produced an average of just over 300 pounds and 113 individual fruit last season. Also in 2021, 42 agroforestry crops yielded 1.1 tons of fresh produce and just over 1,600 ornamental stems, bringing the grand total of fresh produce harvested from the agroforest to over 5 tons. And while I was responsible for much of the harvest last year, I did have help from volunteers, interns, and visiting school groups. Last year, on average, 2 people were able to complete the day's harvest in about an hour and a half. And the cleaning was done in about a half an hour on average. Okay. So productivity is only one aspect of an agroforestry system. In order to better understand the diversity and ecological development within the agroforestry demonstration over time, we systematically monitor the types and frequencies of regenerative practices used. So in 2021 and continuing on into this year, various soil building or soil regenerative practices have been the bulk of the work done in ROBA, which is what we call the agroforestry demonstration. We also conduct historical soil sampling and keep analysis data for future comparison that could indicate soil health. We generally monitor the presence of organisms like animals, dominant weed types, instances of fungi and insects, whether or not they're beneficial or pests. So our routine and systematic agroforestry harvest and data collection done over the year we also include the harvest from breadfruit trees that are growing outside of the ROBA, has provided a consistent source of food or fresh produce to Kauai's communities. In 2021, over 13,000 pounds of fresh produce was donated to nonprofit food banks and pantries that serve local communities across the island of Kauai. And as a part of the mission of National Tropical Botanical Garden, we would like to share what we learn as we learn. So one of the ways that we do that is through providing community access to our collections and inclusion in our work. Because breadfruit is such an abundant producer, there's more than enough work to go around. And basically, I believe that breadfruit necessitates group work and working together and ultimately community. The breadfruit collection, both here on Kauai and on Maui, serve as living classrooms where students, interns, volunteers, and staff are able to get involved in the care and management of the breadfruit collection. So I would like to just mention that Breadfruit Institute is just one component of National Tropical Botanical Gardens programs, as Nina mentioned, and that there are more opportunities to get involved, and I urge you all to seek them out. So thank you. I'll send it over to Nina. My stop sharing, let's see.
Thank you so much, Noel, appreciate it. So there was a comment from William that came in. So he is in Tanzania and is really interested in sharing what he learns today with his community. So if you all didn't see it, just wanted to point out that we do have a breadfruit resources page that has all kinds of guides in it, agroforestry guides and breadfruit guides. So I dropped that link in. That is a really great resource if you want to share more about growing breadfruit. And you can also share today's recording as well. So we are going to go ahead and pass it off to our second presenters today, who are joining us from Denmark. So this is the student project that Nina mentioned. So I'll go ahead and let them take it away.
Emile?
Ja.
All right.
Jeg kan ikke starte videoen. Det er ligesom om jeg er blevet lukket ude. Okay.
Jamen, det er jo Nina styrer PowerPoint.
Okay. All right. Hello to everyone listening in today. I'm Emile, and I have my fellow student and thesis partner Carl with me here. We're from the University of Copenhagen, Denmark. And first of all, we just want to thank you all at the National Tropical Botanical Garden for giving us this opportunity to share our little contribution to the wonderful breadfruit field. This is a short presentation of the data that we had from our bachelor thesis, which we did last year. And we just want to also thank all the great people that have helped us during our thesis. Because of COVID-19, we couldn't be in Hawaii as we originally planned. So thanks to Noel and Nina and the Hawaii Ulu Cooperative, Noel Lincoln, and other great people that have helped us along in Hawaii, we were able to still do this study. So, as I said, because of COVID-19, we weren't actually able to do our research on site, which was a shame. So we decided on a different approach. COVID was and is a global disaster, interrupting food systems globally. And as we are people of the North, where our season of agricultural produce is quite limited, we found it curious how an island which is ecologically able to produce food most of the year is importing 90% of food. And during the crisis of COVID-19, the food system suffered even more as the global food industry was failing of various reasons. In this situation, Hawaii is an isolated island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean with such a high dependency on food from the main island was a rare and interesting case. We investigated, and it was clear that Hawaii was in a food crisis. Restaurants and tourism closing down, people losing their jobs in that industry, and the local food industry basically lost a lot of its conventional sales channels. That kind of situation calls for a massive effort to keep the boat afloat. We saw this as a chance to learn more about the mechanisms that could help to improve food self-sufficiency for the future and also food security in Hawaii. Moreover, we found that breadfruit, as a most nutritious staple food, that is able to give fruit most of the year, deserved our attention. Carl.
Yes, so why are we considering breadfruit? Well, for all of the reasons mentioned on this slide, and because we just heard Noel's talk, and because you're here on this webinar, I think you are well aware of the nice qualities that this tree crop has, and as an heritage crop. But today the crop is partially substituted by other staples like rice and potatoes, which might be imported. And it's said to be underutilized. So this is kind of contradicting, as seems like the obvious answer to the food security issue in Hawaii. And then there are also some commercial challenges, such as a poor shelf life and a seasonal bearing, limiting a steady supply for processing. Yes, to guide our research, we university style construct this research question, where we concerning farming practices, contributing to resilience and the social self-organization amongst farmers. And then we, of course, also tried to ask farmers about their experiences during the pandemic. Because the pandemic is kind of an example of a system disturbance. And that's why we also say shocks such as, because we look at this disturbance to see if the food system is ready for the next disturbance.
Yeah. So looking and understanding resilience and looking at breadfruit from a resilience perspective, we had this resilience framework, which was made by Kaplan and Olefse, which made resilience operational for us. And we could implement these 13 indicators that we retrieved from the framework. And just to express in short what resilience, the concept of resilience is, it's the ability to prevent disasters and crises, as well as to anticipate, absorb, and accommodate or recover from them in a timely manner.
Yes. Yeah, for our materials and methods, we have chosen Hawaii, this beautiful place that we have never been for our case study, because of this thriving scientific community that's there, and NTBG's big genetic collection of breadfruit cultivars, and also because Hawaii is described as a unique place for investigating social ecological systems. So what we did was that we made an online questionnaire and sent it out, and the data we got was actually quite broad. It had good mix of commercial and subsistence growers and people growing in agroforestry systems and in non-integrated systems. But the sample size was way too little. So we could not make any statistical analysis, and our data is more providing an indication of tendencies among the breadfruit farmers than actual statistical information. So this is more, we see our project as more of a preliminary study and might pave the way for more resilient studies in the future.
And on to the participants of the study. They were small-scale farmers from all over Hawaii, or most of Hawaii, and we localized them through the network of local breadfruit stakeholders. And we got answers from the 5 biggest islands that you can see here on the map, but with participants were concentrated on Hawaii main island, as you can see far right corner.
Yes, and what did the farmers actually experience? So this is our results section, and here we have asked for practices that has benefited farm robustness during the crisis, and we see that diversification of crops and having multiple outlets, as well as being engaged in farmer co-ops, have been important. Yes, and then one of our other main findings was that almost all participants agreed that the subsistence value of breadfruit has been increased during the crisis. And we see the same tendency for local produce in general. And this just underlines the importance of breadfruit as a food security crop when there is a crisis economically. And though the reason is terrible, it might also be good news for breadfruit farmers for the business of selling breadfruit. Yes. Yes, and this results we asked the question: has agroforestry practices benefited your farm during COVID-19? And 7 out of 10 said that yes, it has benefited. And we also got some quotes from the participants where they mention for answering why it benefited, and they mention economic resilience and food security as main reasons. And on the right, we see this diagram of different benefit categories, and in this diversity for economic resilience is also ranking the highest. So economic resilience is very important. Yes, and then what Elliot will look way more into, we just asked which varieties participants were growing. And we got a long list, though we have a small sample size. And we see that the highest ranking are the Marfala and Ulufiti, which has really nice nutritional profiles. But the bars in orange, which are the so-called non-seasonal varieties, which provide fruit through almost all of the months during the year, they are kind of underrepresented. So there's a chance that like an underutilized potential to grow these for having a steady supply for processing and just available breadfruit throughout the year.
Yeah, so in our study, we also managed to get some very important data from the food hub called Hawaii Ulu Cooperative, which has about 100 members that grow breadfruit for the cooperative. And from these numbers, we can see how the resilience of food hubs is quite high. We can see how the co-op has been able to pivot their market channels, which you can see on the orange here, especially how they've kind of managed to shift their sales towards the sales channels that were more available during the crisis. And this data validates the indicator of social self-organization and that it's a crucial ability to ensure resilience during a shock.
So for our conclusions, some of the general tendencies is that we see an increased self-sufficiency value of breadfruit. And this is interesting to see in a developed economy like Hawaii's, because breadfruit can grow in many locations throughout the world and also in developing countries. We also see an increased value of local food in general, and that diversification of crops and outlets have contributed to farm robustness.
Yeah, and from farmers, we learned that there's an underutilized potential for using these non-seasonal varieties, or varieties at least with complementary seasons. And we also learned that breadfruit agroforestry can increase ecological and economical resilience. As far as social self-organization during a crisis goes, we learned that Hawaii Ulu Cooperative shows the adaptability and economical profitability during a crisis, which shows how important it is to be united, these small farmers together when a crisis arises. And we also learned that social self-organization is actually perceived by farmers as being a primary source of robustness during the crisis. And lastly, these two results actually indicate that there is a potential for more farmers in cooperatives in Hawaii for the future. So that's it. Thank you so much for listening, and have a great day, evening.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you all joining us from Denmark today. What time is it where you guys are again? Just so everybody can appreciate it.
Past midnight.
Yeah, past midnight.
Yeah, so thank you so much for joining us with that time difference. So we have one more speaker, and then we will have our open Q&A section. So I'll go ahead and pass it off to Elliot. So we've gotten a nice kind of broad view of breadfruit, and he's going to narrow down on some interesting varieties for us.
Hello, everyone. Let me just share my screen. Does this look right?
Right now, we can see the next slide and notes section.
How about now?
Still same. Oh, now it's good. Now you're good.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elliot Gardner. I'm with the International Center for Tropical Botany, which is a partnership between NTBG and Florida International University. I'll beg your pardon about the frog in my voice right now. I'm just fighting off a cold. But there's a link to our topic, which I'll mention when we get to it. So you've all heard of the genus Articarpus,
Yeah.
even if you didn't know it was called that. Breadfruit is Artacarpus altilis, and you may have heard of some of the other Articarpus species that are commonly cultivated, such as jackfruit, or if you're really into tropical fruits, you might have encountered a cempedak or a tarap, which is also known as meringue. But today we're going to talk about the diversity of the entire genus, which has about 75 species, and we're going to talk about some of these other interesting species that are all relatives of breadfruit. One of the reasons we care about these wild relatives, there are a lot of potential reasons, but as we've mentioned, having a diversity of varieties, even within one species like breadfruit, promotes resilience in food systems. And so too, having access to crop wild relatives, which can harbor unique genetic diversity that can be used to improve crops or even develop new crops, is a key part of food security as we move forward into the future with climate change and with the growing populations, especially in the wet tropics. So there was a recent study prioritizing crop wild relatives, just asking, well, for which crops do we have a higher conservation priority? And what they looked at was basically how much of this stuff is actually in gene banks and germplasm collections and living collections. And there's, for Articarpus, for breadfruit, actually very few of the species in the genus are really well represented in collections. So the genus Articarpus, the wild relatives of breadfruit, are considered high conservation priority. So breadfruit, as you know, is largely in the, it's from the Pacific, but the Pacific actually represents the very tail end of the distribution of the genus Articarpus, which begins in India and sort of peters out once you get to the Solomon Islands in terms of its natural range. The center of diversity is the island of Borneo, which you can see labeled here on the map. And if any of you have ever been there or been to Peninsular Malaysia or Sumatra and been in a lowland rainforest, you've certainly seen a lot of breadfruit wild relatives, because the genus Articarpus is a very common canopy tree in these lowland wet forests. So in this photograph here, each red arrow there is pointing to an Articarpus tree. So they're very common in primary and secondary rainforest. The genus Articarpus, as a name, began life in 1776 when the Forster team, father and son, who were the botanists on Captain Cook's second voyage, named the genus based on material that they collected in Tahiti. Since then, many species have been named. Taxonomists have subdivided the genus into subgenera and sections and series. And then within the last 20 years or so, we've been using DNA sequencing to further refine the taxonomy of Articarpus. So the latest word on how Articarpus is subdivided is into 5 subgenera. 2 of them have only 1 species each, Glandulifolium and Enigma, which is named because it's sort of hard to tell where it goes. But most of the species are in Articarpus and Pseudoyaka and Praenia, these 3 subgenera. So I'm going to take you on a bit of a tour through these 3 main subgenera. So subgenus Praenia used to be considered the genus Praenia, but was incorporated into Articarpus a number of years ago. This is different. You might not even recognize a Praenia tree as related to breadfruit, because the leaves are not arranged in a spiral, but actually in kind of a flat plane. And a breadfruit head is a bunch of flowers that are stuck together. And Praenia heads are a bunch of flowers which are near one another, but they're not actually glued together at all. You can see the diagram here, and you can see up here the fertilized flowers actually poke out and you can pick them off like berries. This one is Artocarpus limpato. It's actually quite delicious. I think it's got some potential. It tastes like strawberries and bananas. I'd urge you to try it if you ever get the chance. And there are only 3 species in subgenus Praenia. It's in mainland Southeast Asia, all the way to New Guinea. So the subgenus with the most species in it is actually Articarpus subgenus Pseudoyaka. And these breadfruit the flowers are stuck together, but the ends are separated. And that's why you can see that kind of reticulated pattern on the surface of a breadfruit. In subgenus Pseudoyacca, the flowers are just glued together all the way up to the top. And what you see, if you can see my arrow here, is you wind up with kind of a smooth looking fruit, almost like an apricot. So subgenus Pseudoyacca has 29 species, and this starts in India and ends in the Solomon Islands. It covers the whole range of the genus Articarpus. And one of them you can actually see in NTBG at McBryde Garden, Artichopus parvus. And one of the, besides just large-scale classification, one of the advantages to using DNA to figure out how things are related is we can build something called a phylogenetic tree. These diagrams you've been seeing on the slides are all phylogenetic trees. And you have species names here at the ends here. And if you follow the branches back, everywhere two branches come together, this is called a node. And that represents our hypothesis of a common ancestor. So Artocarpus pithicogallis is related to Artocarpus gongshanensis, and this is their common ancestor. And those two in turn share a common ancestor with Artocarpus pedalotii. A phylogeny can help us figure out if members of a species that we actually do represent all the descendants of a common ancestor. And we found in our phylogenetic work that two quite well-known species in subgenus Pseudoyacca did not represent any such thing. One represented 5 distinct different species, and one represented 7. So you can see the former members of Artacarpus lacucha in blue, and Natitis in pink. The one you can see in NTBG, the label used to say Natitis, now it says parvus, and it's right up here. And that's what the fruit looks like. And this is important not only for knowing what things are, but for conserving things. So when we thought that Artacarpus lacucha had everything in blue in it, you'd say, all right, well, you've got one from India in your collection. That's this stuff up here, and you're fine. But actually, if you want to have a complete conservation collection, you will need the stuff from Borneo and Peninsular Malaysia and the Philippines and New Guinea, because they all represent different species. Speaking of species, we've been describing some new Artacarpus species recently. So this is Artacarpus Rubrosocotis. Rubrosocotis means red socks or red slippers. We named it that because the male flower heads look like a pair of feet wearing red slippers. And this one is endemic to peninsular Thailand, the little narrow neck of the peninsula just before you get into Malaysia. And this is related to Artocarpus lacucha and that complex. Now I'm going to bring you back into the subgenus you've all heard of, the species you're familiar with. So this is subgenus Articarpus with 23 species. It's got breadfruit, it's got jackfruit, it's got marang, and it's got a whole bunch of other things too. This is Artocarpus clementis, which is really very, very delicious. This is Artocarpus Rubrosocotis from Borneo in the Philippines, also very, very delicious. In Artocarpus, you've got flowers that are separate at the top, but are glued together side by side, which gives you something like a breadfruit or a jackfruit head. One thing that these studies can tell us is what the really very nearest wild relatives of a species are. So it turns out jackfruit and cempedak form their own little lineage here. It's this branch here, and there's only one proper wild species. So there's really only one honest to goodness wild relative for jackfruit and cempedak, and it is this critically endangered species, Artacarpus Annulatus. The male flower heads look kind of like a cartoon beehive. It's quite cute. And it's endemic to a few limestone hills in Sarawak. This tells us there needs to be a conservation action for that. And we've done a genetic study. The populations seem to be healthy. Unfortunately, none of these populations are in a protected area. So that is something to work for our collaborators in Malaysia to work toward in the future. You may have noticed that the leaves of ulu or jackfruit look different on seedlings versus in mature trees. This is common in subgenus Articarpus, but those species you are familiar with are not the most outrageous examples of it. So Artocarpus tamaran, which you can see growing at the very bottom of the hill just past the breadfruit orchard in McBryde Garden. has these dazzling sort of palm-like leaves on juvenile trees, which can be up to about 6 feet long. And then they just shrink down to these normal leaves, kind of mimicking a dipterocarp when the tree gets larger. I'll mention one more thing while we're in subgenus Articarpus. Something that the garden has been focusing a lot on lately are biocultural issues. And in biodiversity science, even in primary biodiversity science, then engaging with indigenous knowledge, indigenous taxonomic knowledge, indigenous names for plants can reveal previously unrecognized diversity. So Artocarpus odoratissimus, the meringue, used to be considered this broad species with cultivated and wild trees that were all the same. But it turns out the wild stuff actually has a different name, both for the Iban in Sarawak. The wild stuff is called pingan, the cultivated is lumok. And in Sabah up here, the Dusun have names also for them. And we did a genetic study, and basically this figure is painted into genetic clusters. And you can see the pingan and the lumok are really quite distinct, to the level where we're now recognizing 2 distinct species, Artocarpus mutabilis, which is the wild one, and Artocarpus odoratissimus, which is the cultivated plant. I'll just show you pictures of 2 other new species in subgenus Articarpus before we wrap up. This is Artacarpus bergii, named after Cornelis Berg, who spent a lifetime working on the family that breadfruit is in, the mulberry family. And this is found only on the island of Halmahera. It was discovered during a survey for a prospective nickel mining site. The environmental impact survey required them to collect all the plants and then deposit specimens. And I came across one, and we did some DNA work, and it's a new species, and it's actually quite closely related to breadfruit. And there it is. Another interesting one, also found in on a herbarium specimen, this is Artacarpus Montanus from the mountain forests of southern Vietnam. This is one of only 2 members of the genus Articarpus, the other being Artacarpus excelsus in Borneo, which is actually restricted to cool montane forests. These are cloud forests up in tropical mountains. So those are quite interesting to me in terms of thinking about the range of climates that this genus is able to live in. So with that, I am about out of time. I would just like to acknowledge, so all the work you've heard about, especially the genetic work and the field work in Malaysia, was a collaborative effort between me and all of these people you're seeing here, mostly from Malaysia, and also Dr. Nairi Zaraga from Northwestern University. And this work was funded by a lot of different agencies, including the National Science Foundation. So with that, I'd like to thank you for joining the webinar, and we're all happy to take your questions.
Yes, thank you so much. So feel free to use the chat box to type questions that you have for any of our presenters that you heard from today. And we did have one question I'd like to ask out loud. This one's going to be probably mostly for Noel, but if anybody else has anything they'd like to add, feel free to. So Karen was curious about the shelf life of breadfruit after it is picked, how it is stored, and how it is cooked. So I'd be interested to hear from the panelists on their favorite way to cook breadfruit, if they've ever done that. And I'm also going to again share the link to our website, which has more detailed information that answers all these questions that Karen had. So go ahead, Noel.
So breadfruit shelf life, it's short, but there is a range, and it depends on when it's picked. So I'll talk about mature breadfruit. So mature breadfruit is firm and not soft. If it's picked when it's mature, then the shelf life usually ranges from about a couple of days to up to a week, depending on the maturity of the fruit. So if it's on the kind of bordering ripe mature, it's going to last days, maybe even not a full day. And then the shelf life can actually be extended if you take the fruit and soak it in cool water, or put it into the refrigerator. does that answer your question? And then I put a link also in the chat to the breadfruit production guide, and that should give you a little bit more specific kind of range of what breadfruit shelf life is, as well as some examples of what a mature breadfruit looks like on the tree.
Thank you, Noel. Do you want to share your favorite way to cook and eat breadfruit? Or
oh boy. So my favorite, it depends on what kind of mood I'm in. So I like to just basically pan fry breadfruit, but also I enjoy a steamed breadfruit or shredded and then kind of pan fried as well, and sort of like a hash brown kind of, it's, yeah, delicious.
Thanks, Noel. And on our website, we do have PDFs to recipe books and things like that to give you all ideas. So we had a question come in from Peter. So apart from the breadfruit collection of NTBG, are there other collections of other Artocarpus species around the world, maybe in botanical gardens in Asia?
That's a great question. So yes, some gardens in Asia have some Articarpus collections. Singapore Botanic Gardens has quite a strong collection, and Bogor Botanical Gardens in West Java in Indonesia has quite a strong collection. But the bar is quite low, I would say, for having a strong Articarpus collection, because there are still many species that are not in collections at all, and some of them are quite rare and endangered. So Artacarpus sarawackensis is not in any collections. Artacarpus annulatus, the wild relative of jackfruit. There's one tree in the Semengo Arboretum. I should have mentioned that the Semengo Arboretum in Kuching in Sarawak has quite a strong Artacarpus collection. Part of the problem is that with a genus with such a wide range, from India to the Solomon Islands, you're never going to get everything in one garden. And some areas have prioritized more collecting these species. So I think there's more to do. I see another question there that I think is for me. Monstera deliciosa is called Mexican breadfruit. So Monstera is an aroid. It's related to calla lilies and taro and things like that. The reticulate surface of the fruit looks a bit like breadfruit, so that gives it the common name. But breadfruit is related to figs and mulberries.
Thank you. So Nina, we had a question for you. Matthew was wondering if there was any particular reason that people from Denmark had an interest in breadfruit.
Yeah, well, I should then admit that I'm also a Dane, I guess. And I came to NTBG about 3 years ago. I think breadfruit is receiving increased attention in many places across the world, and that's part of being really the mission of the Breadfruit Institute, to kind of make people more aware of that this crop is there. And I think there's also a tendency nowadays to be more interested in crop wide relatives and crop diversity and agroforestry and so on, as we are trying to take better care of our environment while fulfilling our own needs. And as the students mentioned, sustainability of food in a place where 90% is imported is a very interesting question. So in short, there's no specific interest in growing breadfruit in Denmark. It's far too cold there. But there has been also Marion Lisak has been involved in some of the work with the Breadfruit Institute before, and it's a really interesting case study for a student project. But yeah, I think that's how it came about.
Thank you, Nina. So here's one for Noel. Is regenerative agroforestry the plot planted with different selected breadfruit varieties? And do they cross easily, and could you create a land race with the best culinary varieties?
So the regenerative organic breadfruit agroforestry demonstration was established amongst the Breadfruit Research Orchard, and the research orchard, the breadfruit varieties, which within the research orchard, number 18, well, a little bit less, 16, because there are some tissue cultured duplicates, and the remainder of the trees, like I said, were R, red nut or Artacarpus camansi trees. And so there's 16 different varieties of breadfruit within the agroforestry demonstration, and there are Artocarpus altilis, which are Polynesian breadfruit, and also Artocarpus altilis marinensis, which are Micronesian hybrids. And so we do have seeded breadfruit within the agroforest, and the seeds are viable. That would be a Elliot question as to whether or not you would be able to hybridize a more culinary, specific type of fruit. And so, yeah, maybe I'll pass it over to Elliot to kind of touch on that.
Thanks, Noel. So one of the issues, a lot of the popular breadfruit varieties are triploid, and what that essentially means is their genome doesn't look like yours and mine. It has 3 copies of everything instead of 2, and this means that they're actually incapable of producing pollen and seeds properly. So it's very, very hard to impossible to make crosses with a triploid. That isn't to say that you can't, you couldn't potentially like edit one of them with gene editing. But the seeded material, so the regular diploid breadfruit, which have a normal type of genome, Maafala and Ulufiti are actually diploid cultivars. So in principle, you could they produce pollen and seeds, and you could make crosses involving those and involving the near wild relatives. The main issue is that the generation time for breadfruit is very, very long. So it's not like crossing mustards or flowers or something. You've got to wait quite a minimum of, I now have to pass it back to Noel, but minimum 5 years maybe before you could then harvest a fruit from your cross. And that 5 years may even be optimistic. So certainly on a long range scale, you could make crosses to improve things, but you won't be able to do dozens and dozens of generations. This is where genomics can come in, and you can figure out among all these varieties which ones you want to try to cross so that you can try to get to where you want in like 2 or 3 generations instead of 15.
Thank you. So we had another one, I think maybe a little bit related to this from Michelle. Can you explain in more detail how a Artacarpus wild relative can develop a climate resilient variety?
Sure. So getting back to things that are closely related, you can cross them and make hybrids. So you can look at where things come from and cross things in that sense. We got caught up just now a bit talking about breeding and crossing, but I don't want to detract from what I think is the main point that all of us have been making, which is that there's a lot of diversity out there. There are hundreds of breadfruit varieties, and there are 75 wild species. Within each of those species, there are going to be geographic variants and varieties. So I think the real thing isn't so much, can we create something new from scratch, as can we identify among all these hundreds of possibilities the one that is going to work, and then we can propagate that one and clone it and whatever. And that goes with the wild species too, like breadfruit is more of a savory kind of food, right? It's a starch. Most of the wild relatives are actually sweet fruits, like dessert fruits. But even within some species, like Artichopus Rubrosocotis, there are fabulously delicious ones, and then there are sort of meh ones. So the issue for developing any of these crops is to find out what to collect diversity, find out what the really good stuff is, and then propagate that and figure out how to grow it. And we've got collections of specimens throughout the world. We can tell you what mountain something came from and what the climate is like there. So we're not flying blind in trying to guess like, oh, this species is going to grow in this kind of climate, because we know where it's native to. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much. So I had a question probably for Noel from Arthur. You live on Kauai. What is the best way to find out what type of breadfruit we have on our property? And how can we grow other varieties?
Okay, so, IDing breadfruit can be very hard to do. Just plainly, it can be hard to do. So I think that I would be willing to look at your breadfruit, and based on the subset, which is not a very large subset, even though we have the world's largest collection and most comprehensive collection, as Elliot was talking about, there are so many varieties of breadfruit, but since you're on Kauai, I may be able to help you. So maybe you can send me a picture of your fruit and your tree, and I can try to give my best guess at what you have. And or you can come and visit the National Tropical Botanical Garden at McBryde specifically, and come check out our collection and see if it compares to what you have.
Yes, thank you. You can do that on one of our self-guided McBryde tours, is where you can actually walk up to this agroforest project that Noel's been referring to. And then I also dropped in a link to our page that lists some of the varieties with images for you. So we had a question from Ellen. So the production guide that we shared, she was wondering if she'll be able to find growing information like fertilizing, watering, and other mundane information in those guides.
Oh yeah, the Breadfruit Agroforestry guide is going to be specific to breadfruit, and then that kind of information will also be covered generally in the Breadfruit Agroforestry guide. Yes.
Thank you. And then in the Q&A, I'm not sure if Elliot or Noel wants to pull up the Q&A to see this question. It is from Dr. Gardner. So here on the island of Guam, we have a beautiful species endemic to our region. And I apologize, my Latin pronunciation is pretty bad. So Artacarpus mariensis. It has been on decline due to habitat loss, invasive species, among other things. How much caution should we have when we introduce different breadfruit varieties and other Artocarpus species? This is in terms of preserving the species they refer to, genetics of wild populations.
That's a really good question. Nina, do you want to take that, or would you like me to answer it?
I think everybody has different aspects to add. I think
Okay.
also Noel would
So,
have
yeah,
something to add there.
Well, my short answer, but then I'll turn it over to Noel and Nina, is that you in introducing anything, whether it's a crop species or an ornamental, you have to think about how it's going to interact with what's there. So Noel can tell you there are a lot of triploid sterile breadfruits that can't reproduce themselves except by root suckers, like right next to the tree. So those things should be quite safe. Whether it's a good idea to introduce Articarpus mariensis from another island in Micronesia that could swamp out the local population is a dicier question. These are that lineage of Articarpus is all wind pollinated. So whatever you do introduce, if it's nearby the native trees and it's closely related, it's probably going to interbreed with them.
Yes, so I believe that forgive me for pronouncing wrong, but I believe it's called Dug. And we do have a few trees in McBryde Garden. And I believe also at Kahanu Garden in the collection there. And they readily send up saplings. And so I will second what Elliot said, in that if you're introducing new Dug from a different region, that you may want to be careful if you're trying to conserve your local genetics.
Thank you. So there's just one more question I want to answer real quick, and that's all we have time for. So Matt was wondering about NTBG support and BFI support of breadfruit nurseries and food insecure regions. Noel, can you tell us which organization we partner with to distribute breadfruit trees?
Oh, yes. So we partner with distributor Trees That Feed Foundation, and they distribute through trees that are tissue cultured at Tissue Grown Corporation. And so Trees That Feed works with organizations and communities throughout the Caribbean, as well as Africa and Central America last year. And I think they have some projects and farms that they have distributed to in their home state of Florida as well. So it's Trees That Feed, and then also Tissue Grown Corporation, who which is a lab that distributes the trees or produces the trees, has distributed here to the Hawaiian Islands flats as well.
Thank you so much. So again, it is just past 1 o'clock. If you had any questions that you wanted to ask that didn't get answered, please feel free to visit our website, especially the Breadfruit page. There's a ton of information on there that you can probably find a very detailed answer. But you can also email me, which I'll drop my email into the chat box one more time for you all. Or you can reply to me since I'll be following up with you all with the video recording. If you're interested in finding ways to support all this work that we're doing, you can visit our support page. And of course, like I mentioned earlier, please feel free to share this recording and to share our resources page with folks as well. So I just wanted to thank everybody, all our panelists for joining us today, and thank all of our attendees for coming and listening. We appreciate your questions and hope to see you on April 13th for our next webinar on endangered trees. Thanks, everybody.